One of the 15-mile shadows swallowed New York Harbor, dimming the Statue of Liberty. It was moving directly toward Manhattan. Sporadic clusters of New Yorkers littered the banks of the Hudson. Hundreds of frightened strangers, most of them poor, who'd come to see with their own eyes the grim spectacle they'd spent the day following on their TVs. The mood of hushed anticipation ruptured into a wave of human screams rushing north along the river when the dark ship came into view. Long before the craft's low rumble could be heard over the growl of traffic, the city's collective anxiety swelled into a crescendo. Given their visual cue, the riverside crowds bolted off in separate directions, running for home, the subways, their cars, or wherever else they instinctively felt they would be safe. Over the Bowery and Wall Street, the sky disappeared and a bone-rattling vibration began pulsing through lower Manhattan. Taxi fenders crashed like cymbals. Pedestrians walking along the avenues cleared the sidewalks, hiding themselves in doorways and behind corners when they saw the giant swooping above the city. Everywhere, as car horns blared, people ran out of their houses to watch the ship pass overhead, or ducked into offices and restaurants to get away from it. And everywhere, it seemed people were screaming. David's legs churned through the pitch blackness, taking the stairs 3 at a time. He came to the top, rammed the door open with his shoulder, and stepped outside. The rooftop lay beneath a web of thick cables connecting the satellite dishes and transmitters with the offices below. A moment after he stepped into the sunlight, it was obliterated. Midtown Manhattan was plunged into the same semi-darkness the Earth usually experienced during a total eclipse. "God help us," David muttered, face to face with the low-flying colossus. His first irrational reaction was to stoop down, physically oppressed by the sheer weight of the thing rolling over him. The underside of the ship was an endless black and gray surface stretching away into the distance. Like the computer-designed tread on a knobby tire, it was studded with sharp outcroppings, building-sized projections arranged into complex patterns. Although the thing was well above the city, its overwhelming size was much larger than the island on which David stood. Its western edge protruded well into New Jersey, while the other end was still over Long Island. It seemed to be crashing down on top of him, a mosquito facing the front bumper of a semi. Around him, the equipment on the roof began vibrating, adding its rattle to the steady rumble pulsing through the city. He ran to the north side of the building and watched Central Park fall under the blanket of artificial night. David imagined his father, terrified and alone in his brownstone. He knew Julius would never in a million years abandon his home. He was probably boarding up the windows and barricading the doors, preparing for another Masada. Yet for some strange reason, the picture in David's mind changed to Julius calmly playing chess at the kitchen table. He flashed back to that morning's match in the park, and then, all at once, a horrible realization unfolded in his mind. He made a connection. Oh my God! The signal! In the middle of the Los Angeles basin, the Baldwin Hills were an awkward mix of derelict oil fields and million-dollar homes. Many of the houses commanded views which stretched from downtown all the way out to the ocean at Santa Monica. Magazines called it the most affluent Afro-American neighborhood in the country. Lots of Jaguars and circular driveways. At the top of Glen Clover Drive, sandwiched between a pair of traditional 4-bedroom homes, was a narrow piece of property with a bungalow built on the bluff. This red and white cottage with a neatly manicured yard featured a red wood deck hanging over the city. The rent was obscenely reasonable, making it one of the best rental deals in all of L.A. The tenant was a young woman named Jasmine Dubrow, who had moved west from Alabama only 2 years before. A minivan pulled into her driveway. Its driver, an energetic housewife, Joey Dunbar, unbuckled her passenger's seatbelt, and helped him open the door. "Here's your key, Dylan," she warbled. "Thank you, Miss Dunbar." Dylan, Jasmine's 6-year-old son, accepted the house key, then slid down the seat until his feet reached the sidewalk. He was dressed in Oshkosh overalls, Nike sneakers, and a U&I backpack, the fashion statement of choice among the neighborhood's younger set. "Everybody say goodbye to Dylan," Miss Dunbar chirped. The 3 kids strapped into the back seat waved over the top of the seat. Dylan could see nothing but their hands, but he waved back anyway. "Remember, tell your mommy you can sleep over next weekend, okay? Bye-bye, I'll wait for you to get inside." A Mercedes-Benz convertible came tearing down the street at 50 miles per hour. It flew over a bump, then bottomed out on the pavement. Joey, outraged, turned to see who was driving like that through her quiet neighborhood and noticed the neighbors standing on their roof looking through binoculars. The busybody, she whipped around the other way to see what they were looking at. "What? What's so interesting?" she asked, scanning the block in exasperation. Then she saw the thing in the sky and fell silent. She stared westward over the housetops, unconsciously baring her teeth. She remained frozen until the squealing of tires broke her concentration. Another neighbor had jerked his car into reverse down his driveway, leaving behind rubber as he sped away around the corner. Before Dylan was halfway to the house, his babysitter hit the gas and fishtailed away, leaving the confused boy staring skyward. "Mommy, wake up! Look at this!" he cried, coming through the door. Making a beeline for her room, he jumped on the bed. "Mommy, come outside and see!" Jasmine quickly covered her naked body with the bedsheet, but remained otherwise immobile. "See what, baby? It's too early." "A spaceship!" Dylan had seen similar situations on cartoons and knew exactly what to do. Wasting no time, he sprinted back to the front windows, intending to shoot the thing down. "What's with your dog?" a man's groggy voice asked. Boomer, Jasmine's golden retriever, had started barking and whining a few minutes before Dylan came in. After following the boy into the front room, he returned carrying a high-top basketball sneaker in his mouth and deposited the shoe at the head of a large lump under the sheet next to Jasmine. The lump turned over and threw back the cover. "You're just not going to let me sleep, are you?" Stephen Hiller, a handsome, muscular man in his late 20s, pushed himself reluctantly into a sitting position and stared back at the excited dog. The sour expression on his face showed he needed another hour of sleep. He and Jasmine had been out late last night, closing down Hal's restaurant after hopping between nightclubs. "He's trying to impress you," Jasmine said into her pillow. Groggily, Stephen surveyed the scene around him. Large dolphins splashed and smiled on a poster while several smaller ones, statuettes, were arranged on the dresser and nightstands. A trail of hastily removed clothing led from the hallway to the bed. A framed snapshot of Steve in the cockpit of a fighter jet winked back from the top of the dresser. His and her robes hung on the hook near the bathroom door. He listened to the dog and the kid in the other room, and, for a moment, he was surprised to find himself in such a domestic situation. This is the way married people live, he thought. If the same idea had occurred to him a few months earlier, he would have dressed quickly and hit the road ASAP. But now, slumped against the headboard, he only smiled. I think I like this. He and Jazz had been seeing each other exclusively, passionately, exhaustively for half a year, whenever Steve could get into town for the weekend. But he didn't realize he'd fallen in love with her until a pair of experimental F-19 bombers landed at El Toro Marine Air Base, where he was stationed. Normally, the arrival of such planes would have kept a gung-ho pilot like Steve hanging around the base for a chance to fly them. When he chose to spend the time with Jasmine instead, he knew his priorities were changing. Since graduating from the flight academy, he'd learned to fly every kind of aircraft the service had. When a new airship came through the base, whether it was an old World War II bomber or a highly classified spy plane, Steve always managed to win permission to take her up. On dry weekends, he'd jump in his red Mustang convertible and rip north along the 405 freeway to L.A., his hometown. He'd party all weekend, crashing at his parents' house or at one of his girlfriend's places. He had a reputation of a ladies' man, a smooth operator. Then one night, his parents twisted his arm into going with them to one of their stodgy dinner parties, where, much to his surprise, he became smitten with one of the female guests, the drop-dead gorgeous woman now lying beside him. He turned and examined the perfection of her mocha-colored skin and the graceful way her shoulder curved down to her chest. Boomer continued to whine. He was whimpering and turning in circles with his tail tucked between his legs. Steve knew there was no use in resisting any longer. He was awake for the day. He stood up and padded into the bathroom. While taking his morning leak, he noticed a tall glass jar set on the back seat of the toilet. Was it his imagination, or was the bath oil inside vibrating slightly? He knew he didn't pee that hard. The sound of a low-flying helicopter caught his attention, a Marietta judging from the sound of the engine. When he finished doing his business, he looked out the bathroom's narrow window. He couldn't see the helicopter, but he got a darn good view of the neighbors. A man and wife ran to their Range Rover, flung a few things into the back seat, then tore off in reverse down the driveway. "Kinda weird," he said to his reflection in the mirror. He looked down at the oil in the tall jar. No doubt about it, it was shaking ever so slightly. He stood absolutely still for a moment. Between the gunshots of Dylan's shootout in the living room, Steve thought he heard a low rumbling noise. He hurried out to the bedroom and searched for the remote control. "What you doing, baby?" Jasmine's Alabama accent was stronger when she was tired. "I think we're having an earthquake, and I want to put on the TV." "Where's Dylan?" Jasmine sat up, suddenly wide awake. "Dylan, come here, baby," she shouted into the other room. The television snapped to life, showing a local newscaster reading from her notes. "Through to Southland, but so far there are no reports of injury or property damage. E. Flesher, a spokesperson for the mayor's office, issued a statement from the steps of City Hall only moments ago, urging people not to panic." As the tape of the news conference began to roll, Dylan burst into the room, Rambo style. "Hey, Steve." "Hey, Dylan." The two hugged good morning. "What have you been shooting at, outlaws?" Dylan looked at him like he was crazy. "What outlaws? I'm shooting at aliens." "Aliens?" Steve and Jasmine exchanged a knowing glance. Dylan had a vivid imagination, and they loved encouraging him to spin out his fantasies. His mother asked him, "Did you get any of them?" Dylan only stared back at her, perturbed. He was old enough to know when adults weren't taking him seriously. "You think I'm pretending, but I'll show you." "I'm going to see the spaceship," Jasmine said to Steve as she was being tugged out of the room. "Want some coffee when I'm done?" "I'm coming too. This might be a job for the Marines." On his way to the door, he glanced once again at the television. As they did almost monthly whenever a small tremor rattled the city, the station cut to a shot of the seismometers at Caltech in Pasadena. A true Californian, Steve had learned to ignore earthquakes. But when he switched off the set, the rumbling was still there, growing louder. Plates crashed to the floor in the kitchen, and Jasmine shrieked at the top of her lungs. Steve ran out and found her pulling Dylan away from the window. She was scared out of her wits by something outside. Steve threw open the front door and marched on to the porch, prepared to confront whoever or whatever was out there. Or so he thought. One of the ominous ships was surging toward downtown like a poisonous thundercloud. On this nearly smogless morning, the Santa Monica and San Gabriel Mountains surrounding the city seemed puny, dwarfed by the stupendous size of the object in the air. The entire LA basin resembled a giant stadium with a mechanical roof slowly rolling closed. "What is it?" Jasmine called from inside. Steve moved his lips, but no explanation came out. He cleared his head and made a careful observation. The top of the ship was a low, curved dome, smooth except for a crater-like depression a mile across at the very front of it. Jutting out of this hollowed area was a gleam-black tower roughly the size and shape of a skyscraper. It was perfectly rectangular except where its back wall followed the curve of the depression. The tower was as black as wet tar. Irregularities on its surface suggested doors or windows behind concealing black screens. The bottom was essentially flat and had a distinct pattern to it. It resembled a perfectly symmetrical gray flower with 8 petals. These petals carried a blue tint and ran 7 full miles out the upturned edges of the craft. Seen from a distance, they had the same vein-laced, shimmering transparency of an insect's wings. Each petal appeared to be built of 18 thick slabs, planks laid down in long rows that overlapped to create a jagged surface. Crowded onto them was an array of industrial-looking structures. They looked to Steve like cargo bays, docking equipment, storage containers, observation windows, and other large-scale mechanisms. These structures were not separate pieces bolted individually to the underbelly, but parts of the body, protruding like innumerable hard-edged tumors just below a glistening skin. Further away from him, the eye of the flower was a smooth steel plate with deep lines etched into a simple geometric pattern. At first, he thought these lines might be some kind of hieroglyphic decoration, but when they passed overhead, they looked more like the seams to a set of complicated doors. There was nothing decorative about the ship. It was a floating barge, obviously designed to do a job, not to look pretty. Steve's first reaction was revulsion. It was not only the sheer volume of the thing hanging over them, or the instinctual dread of feeling trapped beneath a potential predator. There was also something disturbing about the design of the craft, something built unconsciously into its architecture. There was a sinister, joyless necessity to it that revealed something ugly and starkly utilitarian about the personalities of its builders. As if all the industrial waste ever produced had been mixed together into one vast sludge heap and transformed into this stunning, intricate, terrifying machine. Still, there was a certain dark magnetism about it, like microscopic photographs of fleas or fungus that reveal a certain hideous beauty.